Eagle Scout. He was a very gifted athlete, being recruited to D1 schools. Everybody thought that Chad was perfect, right? He was a poster child of success. But it was about October of his senior year of high school. Chad was on the phone with his girlfriend one night, and he told her that he was having thoughts of suicide, and that he wanted to end his life. Now, she did what we hope everybody does, and she went to Chad's parents, and she said, I'm really worried about Chad. He's been really down lately. He's talking about hurting himself. He needs some help. So his parents took him to the doctor, and he was diagnosed with depression, bipolar disorder, and OCD. One of the things that came up while he was in treatment was that he had been having thoughts of suicide since he was in 3rd grade. You guys remember how old your 3rd graders are, or were? 8 or 9 years old. So if he was 8 years old when he started feeling like this, but he didn't go to the doctor until he was a senior in high school, how long is that? 9 years, 10 years, right? And one of the analogies we make whenever we're talking with the students and sharing Chad's story is, if you had diabetes for 9 years, what do you think would happen? If you didn't go to the doctor, you didn't get your insulin that you needed, you'd be really, really sick. It'd be really hard to get better. And the same is true for depression. The longer that somebody has it, the longer that it goes untreated, the harder it is to get better. They did everything that they could for Chad, but unfortunately, he lost his battle with depression in April of 2004. He was about 1 month away from graduating from high school. But one of the things that Chad had said before he died, he was having a good day at the time, and he said, Mom, when I get better, I want to go back to my school and say, my name's Chad, and I have depression. And I want everybody to know that there's resources, and I don't want anybody to go through what I went through. And so that's what his parents did. They turned his tragedy into a legacy. We serve over 200 schools throughout Missouri through the Signs of Suicide program, our social emotional mentoring program, and our family support counseling program. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those. But that's our whole goal, and that's why we do what we do. Because suicide is the #2 cause of death for middle school students, the #2 cause of death for high school students. From the time a kid is in 5th grade until they graduate from college, graduate from high school, go into college, go to grad school, maybe get married, start a family, suicide is the #2 cause of death. Okay? Some other things that we've also learned is that members of the LGBTQ+ community are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight counterparts, right? Also, due to the aftermath of COVID, I was seeing some studies finally come out. A lot of people speculated that suicide was going to go really high when kids were home and isolated. But what we actually saw was that when schools were closed, suicide rates went down. And then as kids went back to school, they started to increase again because a lot of the bullying and social media and social interactions that happened. Okay? So this is a problem, and we're in the midst of a mental health crisis for our kids. I think for everybody, we can safely say that, but especially for our kids who need these resources and need this help. So what is your role, and what does this mean for you? Suicide is an attempt to solve a deep psychological and emotional pain. These people usually feel like they have run out of options. But what we know is that if we can get resources in place and provide those services and interventions as early as possible, the more likely it is that our young people will go on to live happy, healthy lives. Most of the time, suicide can be very preventable, and we'll talk about some of those things here in a moment. But just reducing access to lethal means, having a connectedness or one single reason to live. And adults play a really important role in that. There are lots of studies that show that if a student is connected to just one adult, whether it's in their school or at home or in the community, their risk for suicide plummets because they have that one connection to an adult, to somebody that cares about them. So protective factors and risk factors are 2 things that we talk about a lot whenever we think about mental illness, and specifically when we think about suicide. So protective factors are personality traits or environmental qualities that reduce a person's risk for suicide, right? It keeps them safe. It's like a safety net for them. Another way to think about it is a resiliency factor. things that can build their resiliency and make it easier for them to bounce back from difficult life situations. A risk factor is sort of the flip side to that. It increases a person's risk. It makes it harder for them to bounce back from those difficult life situations. And sometimes we can control them and sometimes we can't. Okay? So what do those things look like? This is at an individual level. So some protective factors or resiliency factors is having a reason for living. I was just reading or getting an update on one of our clients back in St. Louis, and they had disclosed to their therapist that they were feeling really suicidal one day last week and walked to a bridge by their house and stood on the ledge. And stood at the edge of that ledge, but then their nephew popped into their head. And so they stepped off the ledge and walked back home. So that one reason for living is what kept that child from attempting to end their life, right? So it's a huge protective factor. When we do safety planning for kids, that's one of the main things that we always talk about, because we know that even if it's just a pet, if it's just a cat at home, right, that can reduce a person's risk. Having effective coping skills and problem-solving skills, knowing what to expect and being on a routine can also be really helpful in terms of protective factors. So knowing what to expect whenever they get home from school, knowing what to expect when they get to school, right? That routine, school can be a really good protective factor most of the time, okay? On the flip side of that, some risk factors could be a previous suicide attempt, substance use, previous history of mental illness, or having a family history of mental illness can be a risk factor as well. Also, their outlook on the world, and this might be on the next slide, so forgive me if I'm jumping ahead. But I always like to think of the world is full of lots of different people, but most people fall into two categories, which is glass half full and glass half empty. Which one do you think is at higher risk for suicide? Half empty, right? They just have a more hopeless outlook on life. It's tougher for them to problem solve. Those resiliency factors aren't as high, or they aren't as strong. So thinking of it in terms of that as well. Getting my steps in with this, which is good. Okay, so going a little bit deeper, there's also relationship protective factors within the community, so feeling a sense of belonging or feeling that sense of connectedness. Societal reduced access to lethal means, so that means not having access to firearms. Or even if there are firearms in the home or they have access to them, they don't have access to the ammunition, right? What can we do to make it as difficult as possible for somebody to attempt to take their life? Most of the time, somebody who is suicidal, they might be thinking about it for a really long time, but then one thing happens, it's called like a precipitating or a trigger event, that pushes them from thinking about it to moving forward with an attempt. So if we can make it harder for them to get access to whatever it is that they were going to use, whether it's a firearm, medication, anything like that, if we can make it difficult and slow them down, it increases the chances that they're going to be out of that suicidal crisis before they get to the method that they were going to use. So reducing access is a huge, huge protective factor. Risk factors, you can see, so we won't go through all of them. Bullying or being mistreated. Abuse, whether that's physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, any type of abuse is going to increase a person's risk significantly. Not having access to healthcare, and that's healthcare in general, but also specifically not having access to mental health care. So I always, this is always very shocking, but it has not changed in the many years that I've been doing this. Your ability to get access to a child psychologist or a counselor for your child, the wait list is anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on where you live and how much money you have, right? So it's not that we don't want to help our kids, it's that there's no help for them sometimes. And that is really difficult as well. Okay? Or just not having the means or the modes of transportation in order to get to that healthcare and to get to that appointment. That's also a barrier and can be a risk factor in itself. The stigma around mental illness is obviously one of the biggest ones. That's why we do what we do, because we know that if we can talk about it and normalize this, normalize the conversation around mental health, that people are going to be more willing to come forward. And I think we can definitely say that our Gen Zers, our little ones, are really good about talking about mental health. They want to have this conversation. And that's where it's our responsibility as adults to be able to have that conversation with them and to educate ourselves so that when they come to us, we know how to respond. We have an understanding of what they're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Signs of Suicide program. You have sort of the foundation of mental illness, well, sort of the foundation of suicide and protective factors and risk factors. So let's talk about how we talk with this to the kids about this stuff. So every single session, we do a pre-survey and a trigger warning. So just like I did with you guys, I say, hey, this is really tough stuff. And it's hard to think about sometimes. I even say to the kids, you might be having one of those days where you just can't do it. And that's okay. And we always give them permission to leave if at any point they start to feel activated or triggered or just start to feel like, I can't do this right now. Part of that means that they are either escorted or followed by their teacher to the counselor's office. So it's not a free pass, and I typically make this joke at the high schools. It's not a free pass to like walk the hallways. You can't just leave because you don't want to do this today. But we want to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. And if they're feeling uncomfortable and they just need a minute, that's totally okay with us. We always tell CHADS story. I typically tell it the way that I said it with you guys. I'm trying to give you a good understanding of what that would be like for your student whenever it comes time for them to participate. And then we talk about the warning signs of depression, the warning signs of suicide. We do talk about anxiety as well, and I'll show you those slides and kind of walk you through what that conversation looks like as well. What we teach in all of our presentations is the ACT technique. So acknowledge that you're seeing the signs and symptoms, show that you care, and then tell a trusted adult. Okay? Then we do a video with some discussion to make sure that it's really interactive. One of the things we pride ourselves on at CHADS is really engaging with the students and making a conversation, meeting them where they are, and helping them understand, getting an understanding of what they know, and then helping build on that understanding that they already have. At the end, we do a screening for depression and give them an opportunity to ask to speak to a counselor. And then we always go over resources and of course do our post-survey. So what does this actually look like? Again, we talk about anxiety. This is the actual slide that we talk about, or that we use with our students. So what would you say anxiety is? You're gonna have to shout because I'm all the way up here now. Yeah, go ahead.
It's this, too scared to say.
Yeah, so sometimes it's too scared to talk in public, right? Absolutely. What else? Sometimes is it your brain moving really fast and you can't really slow down to complete a full thought, or you can't focus on the task at hand because your mind is going like a million different places. Or something that I tend to do is I call it spiraling, where I think of one bad thing and then the next bad thing because that bad thing happened, and then and then all of a sudden you're in this really deep rabbit hole. Think about 5 years down the line how terrible everything is when it's like, that was never gonna happen. Why didn't you think about the good thing that could happen, right? So that's a function of anxiety in itself. What causes anxiety? What makes us feel anxious? Talking in front of people, you said that one. What makes our kids anxious? Feeling out of control, absolutely. What else? Say that again. Expectations, yeah. Feeling like they have to be perfect or they have to be high performing, definitely.
I think the unknown.
The unknown, yeah. What about going to a new school? When we think about, especially our adolescent kids, they are going from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school, from high school to college, or the workforce, whatever they decide to do. That's a lot of transition in a really short period of time, right? Oh, also they're going through puberty. Also, their interests are changing and their friends are changing. So there's all of these things happening, right? And they're at an increased risk for mental illness just because they're adolescents and their brain chemistry is changing, right? That's a lot of transition. That makes sense that they would have some anxiety, right? So we won't go through the symptoms a lot, but I will say this slide is definitely one that a lot of the kids identify with. But what we don't want to do is say, okay, well, just because you feel some of these things, does that mean that you have an anxiety disorder? No, right? So what's the difference between feeling nervous before you give a speech, or before you give a presentation, like what I'm doing, or before you have a big sporting event or something like that? What's the difference between that nervousness and getting like, sweaty palms, your increased heart rate, and an anxiety disorder? How do we know the difference?
When it impacts your ability to function on a daily basis.
Yeah, when it impacts your ability to function, when it gets in the way of your daily life, right? So what I always say to the kids is when the symptoms are persistent and pervasive. So persistent means it happens more often than not, and pervasive means it gets in the way of your daily life. It gets in the way of your ability to function. That's when we want them to talk to a trusted adult, right? It's normal to feel some of this from time to time, right? You guys heard me at the beginning. I'm still talking really fast, but I've caught my breath now because I've calmed down. I'm in the flow. So it went away, the adrenaline was kicked in, and I'm doing okay, right? But if I was so nervous and so anxious that I was like throwing up in the hallway before I came in to do this, would that be a problem? Yeah, probably, right? So keeping in mind that the symptoms have to be persistent and pervasive. Okay? So now let's talk a little bit about depression. So again, this is a exact slide that we use with our students. I'm gonna facilitate this a little bit differently. Looking at these symptoms that are up here, as adults, how many of these look like typical teenage behavior to you? All of them. How many of you have experienced some of these in the last week? Right? That's what's really hard about depression, is that it looks like a bad day sometimes, or a series of bad days strung together. And it definitely looks like teenagers. Angry, withdrawn, don't want to eat, their appetite changes, right? So how do we know the difference? How would you, as an adult, or as a parent or a teacher, how do you know the difference between somebody that's just having a bad day, or a teenager that's just having a rough day, and something that's going to be a little bit more serious, like having depression?
I think maybe comparing it to their good days and how much time between the good days and bad days.
Yeah, so looking at their good days, comparing, or looking at how much time between the good days and the bad days, definitely. I think it's important with this to trust your gut. And remember that we know these kids, and that if our gut is telling us, like, well, something's wrong, it's totally okay to say, hey, what's been going on? You've been really withdrawn lately. I noticed that, like, I know you don't want to talk to me all the time, but you're not even talking to your friends anymore. What's up, right? And I always think of, as parents, we know our kids better than anybody else. You birth them, you know their baseline personality, because you've been around them for their whole lives, right? So I am one of 5 siblings, or one of 5 kids. I have an older sister, an older brother, and 2 younger brothers, so I'm the middle child. My sister is about 3 years older than me, and she is just emotional, right? She's got a lot of feelings, she always has, and that's great, we love her, that's how she is. So when she got to high school and she was having mood swings all over the place, do you think my mom was very worried? No, that's just Megan. That's what she does. Still to this day, she kind of goes all over the place, right? Now me, I wouldn't say calm, but I'm pretty bubbly for the most part, right? My mom loves to tell the story that my whole life, I would wake up and just be really happy. I've always been a morning person. I don't need a lot of sleep. I'm generally pretty happy and have a pretty positive outlook on life. Now, if I had gotten to high school and I was really like sleeping all of the time, and I was really grumpy all of the time, and I started to have a really negative affect, do you think my mom would have been worried? Yeah, that was way outside my normal functioning and my normal personality, right? So trusting that. Similarly, one of my younger brothers is just a sleepy kid. He just sleeps all the time. He's 30, I think. And he sleeps all the time. Like yesterday, I tried to talk to him a couple times, and he was sleeping all day, because that's just what he does. So when he got to high school and he was sleeping a lot, was my mom very worried? No, he just sleeps a lot, and that's who he is. So again, trusting your gut and knowing that you know your kids, right? And that you know when something is a little bit off, and when you see those behavior changes, right? One of the things we do say to the students in this is, we acknowledge that like a lot of this is normal, and that we feel a lot of this a lot of the time. And we might feel it for a whole week sometimes. But does that mean that we have depression? Not necessarily, right? But again, when it's persistent and pervasive, that's when we want them to talk to somebody. When it's happening more often than not, when it's interfering with their daily life, when it's getting in the way of their ability to function. So these are the warning signs of suicide that we teach. Again, this is not necessarily all-inclusive. It does overlap a little bit with risk factors, things like substance abuse, a previous suicide attempt, things like that. But we frame it as warning signs, or like red flags, and things to pay attention to if they start to see these warning signs in their friend. So talking or writing about suicide, and this includes posting on social media, right? Whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat, might be saying things like, I wish I was dead. I just can't take this anymore. Everybody would be better off without me. Right? Saying things that indicate that they are hopeless, that they feel really helpless, that they feel like a burden to the people around them, that they're holding people back, they're weighing them down. Right? I can't talk to my mom about that. She already has too much on her plate. I don't want to stress her out more. I don't want to make it worse. Okay? Increasing substance abuse. So using drugs or alcohol to the point that it is, they're using it to numb themselves or to get away from the pain. About 33% of suicide attempts occur while an individual is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So think about alcohol specifically. Generally speaking, when people use alcohol or drink to excess, do they make good decisions or bad decisions? Generally bad decisions, right? They're also more aggressive, so they're more likely to get into a fight or get into an argument. And they're also more likely to do things that they wouldn't normally do, so lowered inhibitions, right? It might be singing a karaoke song or doing something silly like that, but whenever we're talking about teenagers who are already incredibly impulsive, and they're depressed, and they're suicidal, and then they drink to excess, that's a recipe for disaster. So paying attention to that substance abuse, and substance abuse or misuse can also be a really good way to identify students before it even gets to this point. So if we're seeing those behavior changes as a warning sign for depression, for example, that can be a way to get an intervention in place before they get to the point of being suicidal. Serious behavior problems in or out of school. What do you think that means? What do we mean by behavior problems? And I know we're talking about teenagers, right? How many of your teenagers have broken the rules at any point in time? Yeah, right? I was a sneaky teenager, so I didn't break the rules like overtly, but whenever I did, it was bad, like very bad. Right, so teenagers do that. That's developmentally appropriate. They're supposed to be towing the line, finding those boundaries, and seeing how far across them they can get before getting in trouble, right? Again, totally normal. That's why they're always pushing the boundaries and arguing with us as adults. That's what they're supposed to be doing. That's their brain figuring things out. So what's the difference, do you think, between normal teenage stuff and just finding those boundaries and something that could be a warning sign for suicide? And it's usually the intent, right? Why are they doing this? Why is somebody continually putting themselves in dangerous or risky situations, right? I did this talk, gosh, several years ago now, to a parent group, and one of the dads said, well, I was a teenager and I was a boy, so I did stupid stuff all the time. Like, I was always doing dangerous stuff. And I said, yeah, but why'd you do it? And he said, oh, well, to make my friends laugh. And I said, oh, okay, so do you understand now? You're making your friends laugh, but that's not, you weren't doing it because you want to die. You weren't doing it because you don't care about the consequences, right? So understanding that the intent is a really big deal when it comes to those behavior problems. Tunnel vision or all or nothing thinking. So if I don't get an A on this test, I'll never get into college, I might as well die. This person doesn't want to be my boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, friend, there's no point in living. Is that a normal thought process? Not usually, right? Most of the time, even as teenagers, they can see the hope in a situation, or they can see the alternative decisions or alternative outcomes, if you will. Okay? Giving away favorite things. So giving away favorite things or doing things like making amends. So saying they're sorry, saying I love yous at the last minute. Some kids might even go so far as to clean out their locker or clean up their room so their parents or caregivers don't have to do that after they're gone. A sudden sense of calm or happiness. This one's really hard, and we always we'll talk about it with the kids, or at least I do, because I think it's important. If somebody has been really sick for a really long time, and they come back to school tomorrow, and they just seem like they're 100% better, why is that a warning sign for suicide? Yeah. A lot of times it means that they've made a decision. They know how and when they're going to end their life, and so they feel this sense of relief. It's also described as like euphoria, right? So just feeling this weight has been lifted. I don't have to suffer anymore. I don't have to worry about people being mad at me anymore, right? And that was really hard because if somebody's been sick for a long time, especially when we think of our kids and their friends, like if their friend has been sick and they come back to school and they're all better, or they seem really happy all of a sudden, they're like, oh my gosh, cool, you feel better, that's awesome. And we're like, yeah, you figured it out, and we're happy, right? Because they figured it out, we're on the up and up. But it's important to remember that depression is an illness just like any other illness. And even if I always use the analogy of the stomach flu. So if you have the stomach flu, are you 100% better 24 hours later? No. You might be able to go back to school or go back to work, but your stomach's still queasy, you still have to like ease into eating some of those foods, that type of thing, right? It takes time to get back to 100%. And depression and mental illness is the same. It takes time and treatment in order to get better. It doesn't just go away overnight. Okay? And we talked about having a history of depression. One thing that I always try to emphasize is that just because somebody has depression does not mean that they are suicidal or ever will be suicidal. And that's really important to remember, that depression does not equal suicide. However, like I said at the beginning, the longer that depression goes undiagnosed and untreated, the more likely it is to lead to suicidal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So, ACT, like I said, is what we teach in all of our presentations. So, acknowledge that you're seeing the signs and symptoms. Show the person that you care, and then we teach the students to tell a trusted adult, and you all, as the adults, your job is to seek treatment. So, especially if you're the parent or the caregiver, that means your job is to call the doctor, call the school counselor to get a referral, help them get to that next step so that they can get the treatment and get the intervention that they need. Okay? When we talk about this, we always have students identify who a trusted adult is to them, like in their school, in their community, in their home. We make sure that they understand that it's not necessarily their friend that they really like to talk to, that it's an adult. An adult means somebody that can help you make that next step. So it might be a school counselor, it might be a coach, it might be the janitor who they have a good relationship with, and that's fine. Whoever can help them get to that next step, to get the help that they need, to make that appointment, get that assessment, etc. All right, so the last thing that we do, and I mentioned this at the beginning, the last thing we do in all of our student presentations is a screening for depression, and then a student response slip, or a self-ID, as we call it. So this part is the screening, these top 7 questions. When we do it with the students, it's 2 different slides, but just for ease and convenience, I use the second slide. So these top 7 questions is what we ask them. They keep track in their head the number of yeses that they have. And then we work through what their answers might mean. Okay? Okay? And we use that exact language, what your answers might mean. This is not a diagnostic tool. Just because they have a few yeses does not mean that they definitely have depression or that they are suicidal. But it's a way for them to reflect on how they've been feeling and know whether or not they need to talk to a counselor or a social worker or whoever is in the building to help them. Okay? So the bottom half of this is sort of the scoring that we use with them. Again, this is a validated questionnaire or a validated tool. It's called the Brief Screening for Adolescent Depression. And I'll work through what the scoring means just for reference for you guys. So we say, if you answered yes to 4 or more questions, or either of the 2 questions about suicide, so that's question number 4 and question number 5, we definitely want you to talk to somebody as soon as possible. You're showing signs of depression and potentially some suicidal behaviors, and so we want to make sure that somebody can talk with you and get you connected to the resources that you need. If you answered yes to 3 questions, we want you to talk to somebody sooner rather than later. You might be showing signs of depression, so we want somebody to check in, see what's going on, and get you resources if you need them. And if you answered yes to 0, 1, or 2 questions, it's unlikely that you have depression. You're not showing any signs or symptoms right now, but it's important to pay attention to the warning signs and talk to a trusted adult if you start to feel any different or see any changes in behavior. So that's a way for us to give them an action item in that moment so that they know whether or not they should ask to talk to a school counselor. Okay? The second part of this is taking the act and putting it into action. So every single student gets a little one of these slips. It's an actual paper slip that we give them, that they have to choose one of 3 options. Everybody has to fill it out. We sometimes call it an exit slip because they can't leave the class until they complete this slip. Now they have 3 options on this slip. The top box says, I need to talk to a trusted adult immediately. As in today, 911, before I go home from school, I need to talk to the school counselor. I'm really worried about myself. I'm really worried about somebody I know. I'm worried something bad might happen if I don't talk to the school counselor today before I go home from school. So like red light, gotta talk to somebody ASAP. That's the top box. The middle box says, within a few days. So what I always say is, or it says later this week. I always say, so if you definitely want to talk to a counselor, but it's not an emergency, it can wait until Thursday or Friday, or Monday if it's like a Thursday. If it can wait, but you definitely want to talk to somebody, that's that middle box. So maybe as we were talking, a friend kept popping in your head, and you want to make sure that they get a check-in, but you don't feel like it's an emergency. That's that middle box. Or maybe as we were going through the symptoms, you thought, dang, I've been feeling like that a lot lately, but I don't really know, right? So that, like, you're not totally sure, but you think you want to make sure that you get a check-in from the school counselor, that's the middle box. The bottom box says, I don't need to talk to anybody. So if you feel like you're good, your friends are good, that's cool, you can check that bottom box. Everybody fills out a slip, everybody checks a box, and only check one box. We want to make sure that we make it as easy as possible for the school counselors to prioritize the slips and how they're filled out. So if anybody leaves it blank or they check multiple boxes, we typically treat it like a 911, like an emergency, and they talk to the school counselor immediately. And that just helps us with making sure the kids follow directions, but also helps the school counselors with prioritizing which slips need to be seen first. Okay? It is also identified, so they put their name, their grade, their teacher, so that the school counselor knows who exactly to follow up with. Honestly, sometimes we have kids put little notes on there, like, I'm worried about my friend, and that's why I want to talk to somebody. Or, I've been feeling this way lately, but I already have a counselor. And that's okay, they still get a check-in. And what I always tell them, if they already have a counselor or a psychiatrist or services in place, and they are okay until their next appointment and they feel good, then they can check the bottom box, and that's okay. Right? It's all based on this presentation and how they're feeling that day and whether or not they want to talk to somebody that day, basically, or that week. Are there any questions about this part of the process? We'll do questions at the end, but this is like a lot to digest sometimes. So, we always have all of the students fill out that slip. And then what happens is the students will, that check one of the first two boxes will be called down to the counselor's office, try as inconspicuously as possible. What we don't want to do is make the student feel embarrassed or self-conscious that they asked to talk to a school counselor. As much as it is our job to reduce the stigma, that doesn't mean we're going to shout it to the rooftops that Susie or Johnny checked this box and need to talk to the counselor, right? We want to protect them and protect how they're feeling as much as possible. So we do that as inconspicuously as we can, or the school does. And then the school counselors check in with them and say, okay, you checked this box, tell me what's going on. Tell me how you're feeling. Typically, as a result of that conversation, a phone call home will then happen. Sometimes that's with the student there, sometimes it's not. It always depends on the situation. It depends on what this child is most comfortable with as well. Sometimes they want to be in the room, sometimes they don't, and that's totally okay. The school counselors typically navigate that based on a student-by-student basis. But that's whenever there's a call home and it just says, hey, this is what happened today. They checked this box on the slip, this is what our conversation looked like, and then the counselor will be able to give you next steps based on what they recommend. Sometimes it's as simple as, hey, they checked this box, but it's really just because it's soccer season and they're really extra tired, we think, but we're gonna keep an eye on it, okay? So maybe do a check-in whenever you get home. Other times it is a little bit more serious, where we need to do like a risk assessment and safety planning, and other things that happen. I will say only 2% of them occur, 2% of the kids that respond are actually actively in a suicidal crisis when they get to the school counselor. So that's really good. What that means is that we're doing our job, right? But on average, about 10%, so on average it's 12% of kids will self-ID. 10% of those kids do need some sort of intervention or some sort of additional support. And so that's when the school counselor will say, they check this box, we're just gonna start checking in once a week. Or I would recommend you going to see an outside counselor. Very rarely is it a student coming forward that they're actively in crisis and need to be hospitalized or something like that. Okay? But the upside is that it definitely catches those kids before they get to a suicide attempt, before they can fall through those cracks. Okay? So part of this means that you might get a call home whenever this happens. And what you're managing your own reaction is really, really important. Because a lot of the times, the reasons that we don't know that our kid might be struggling with depression or anxiety or something else is because they're scared. They don't want to let us down. They don't want to stress us out. They don't want to make things worse for us than they already are. They want to protect us, right? And I think that you all can probably say that you might feel the same way about your parents. I definitely do. I hate giving my parents bad news or anything less than good news, right? I'm very protective of how they feel, and our kids feel the same way about us. And so managing how we respond is really important. Meeting them with empathy and compassion. So not saying, well, why do you feel that way? You have really good grades and you have lots of friends. You shouldn't be depressed, right? What do you think that's gonna do if we say that? Just shuts them down. Say, okay, well, you don't understand. Or what is wrong with me? I should be happy, right? Why? I don't know. I can't figure it out. I'm broken. Making sure that we also have a supportive person to talk with before and afterward when talking with our child, whether that's a partner or a friend, because we are human. As adults, we're still human and we have our own emotional responses. I'm not lucky enough to have my own kids yet, but I can't imagine what it must feel like to have my child come to me and say, I am suicidal, or I want to hurt myself. That's devastating as a parent. And it's okay to be emotional about it. Our job in the moment is to help our kid get from point A to point B and get the help they need, and then have our emotional response afterward, right? Then we go to our own therapy, we engage in our own supportive services to make sure that we're okay. Marion McCorder, the executive director and founder, always says, you can't pour from an empty cup. And we need to do what we need to do to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of our kids. And if we're not taking care of ourselves, then our kids aren't gonna get any better in the long run either. It's also important to make sure that we aren't pretending that we have all of the answers. Even if you are trained in mental health and have a background or you are a counselor, it's your child. And so you can't have the answers, you're too close to it. And so making sure that we're leaning on those other supports. Call your school, call the school district. These counselors have so many different resources and they've dealt with this situation before in some way, shape, or form. So they're gonna be able to provide some support and insight for you. And most importantly, don't keep it a secret. Don't pretend like it's not happening. It's really important that we acknowledge it and make sure that we are accepting of our kids where they are, and that we help them get help. And by pretending it's not a problem or keeping it a secret, even from other members of the family sometimes, we need to do what we can to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. Okay. Oh, I did actually pretty good on time. So these are some resources for you guys. At CHADS, we do specialize in working with teens who are struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicide. We're based out of St. Louis, so we're about an hour and a half to 2 hours from here. But we do have licensed and provisionally licensed counselors on staff that can work with kids via telehealth. So online, they can have virtual appointments. And then we also have a social emotional well-being program where we can do mentoring for kids, kindergarten through 12th grade. And we can also do that virtually. And that's focusing on their social emotional skills, such as self-awareness, responsible decision-making, social awareness, self-management, all of those different things. And that's really great, especially for the younger ones that maybe they don't need therapy yet, but they could definitely benefit from some additional resources. Okay? 988 is the suicide crisis lifeline. They just changed it from a 10-digit number to a 3-digit number this summer. So there is lots of different resources. If you call 988, just like dialing 911, you'll be connected with a crisis counselor. I always tell the kids they can call this anytime, day or night. It's also totally anonymous. The only time that they contact authorities or anything is if their safety is in question. So if the crisis counselor on the line feels like the child is not safe or the person is not safe, then they will send someone for a health and safety check. But other than that, it's there for somebody to talk you through it. Similarly, especially for our kids who don't like to talk on the phone, the crisis text line is the same concept. It's just texting instead of over the phone, like a phone call. So that's a great, great resource. The other two up there, RAIN is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. I always include that just because suicide rates and even substance abuse rates are super high in people that are victims of rape, abuse, and incest. So that's a great resource. And the Trevor Project is a national resource for LGBTQ+ specific communities. So I'm gonna put my post survey up there, and I have time for questions. So I didn't run over for once, so.
If anybody has questions, I'm gonna bring the mic to you because we're live streaming and that way they can hear as well. There we go.
So the ACT seems like it's a good training to help a student recognize a fellow student that's in need. Do you do anything to train students that are feeling suicidal on what they can do to get to a healthy place?
So we do, I'm gonna give you a twofold answer. So when we talk about the ACT technique, we also reference myself. Like, I recognize that I haven't been feeling well. I need to care enough about myself to seek treatment or to tell a trusted adult how I'm feeling. So we do that in tandem, if that makes sense. The other part we cover, which I did not talk about tonight, is in every one of our presentations, we talk about healthy coping skills and the importance of having self-care and healthy coping skills in place. And with that if they don't have those in place, or if those healthy coping skills are not working, then they need to tell a trusted adult. So our goal is always to get them to not just talk to each other, because we know that's what kids do, is like, I'm gonna tell my friend how I feel, or I'm gonna notice how my friend feels before we go to a trusted adult, we're gonna talk about it. So our whole goal is to still be there for each other as peers and as friends, but to get them to a trusted adult, so then that trusted adult can move them forward into getting treatment and stuff. Does that make sense? Awesome.
Sorry if you already answered this. Was
there a reason specifically for 6th grade and 9th graders to take the training?
Here in Hannibal specifically, or just in general?
Just in general or in Hannibal?
Yeah, so I will let Megan answer in Hannibal specifically, but I will say from a programming standpoint, so the Science of Suicide program CHADS doesn't own. We partner with an organization called MindWise Innovations. They're based out of Boston. And they did all of the research behind the program and found that it was evidence-based for 6th grade through 9th grade. Part of the reason we focus on 6th grade and 9th grade specifically is that those are transition years, going from elementary to middle school and then middle school to high school. We do also have a program for life after high school, so it's called Second Act for College. We also have programs for every single grade that is just a little bit different, so it reviews. But that's why we focus on 6th grade and 9th grade is their transition years. So it's virtually the same presentation, except how we facilitate it in 9th grade just looks different. And we often say, okay, why do you think we're back? And the kids always know, well, because high school kind of sucks, you know? So they understand that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I would echo what she said as well, with starting in Hannibal, and I know the program actually spans additional grade levels, but with it being a new program, we wanted to start it out at some of those pivotal times with 6th and 9th grade being big transitional years, with the opportunity then to expand if it's something that we would choose to. Any other questions?
First, thank you for the good presentation. What would this might be for you a little bit, Mrs. Carver, what would the implementation look like? I think you touched on it a little bit as far as the survey. Is this like maybe I missed some of that as well. Is this once in the beginning of the school year type of survey, and then the teachers and counselors at the school system kind of monitor these principals or tenants, or what does that look like, actually, the implementation?
That's a great question. So we come in typically one time a year, and we do this lesson, and again, it looks a little bit different for each grade level, depending on who we're talking to, but we come in one time a year. The pre and post survey is encapsulated in that presentation, that one time that they have it. What we do like to do is partner with school districts to get some of that data over the course of the year, so we can see not only how many kids self-ID'd because of this presentation, but then how many risk assessments are we doing? How many, what other things are happening in the school because of this that's a little bit more longitudinal, if that makes sense. That's like a high level answer. But we come in one time a year and do one presentation. We typically, I don't know what class we're pushing it through for 6th grade or 9th grade, but oftentimes it's like through math or PE or health or one of the core classes that all of the kids cycle through on a given day. And that way we don't disrupt their actual schedule all that much. It's just a special presenter in that one particular class. Because talking about this stuff is hard, and so we want that routine to be as natural as possible. Also, our whole goal at CHADS is for mental health to be part of the standard curriculum no matter what. That hopefully we get to a time when kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade, we're talking about mental health the whole time. So that it's just a natural part of the culture and natural part of society that we're talking about this. So, does that answer that question? Okay.
Right, so at the middle school level, we're looking at our PE and health classes because every 6th grader will go through those. And then at the 9th grade, we're looking at freshman seminar in health, which is a split block. And so they'll be able to get it there.
Any other questions?
I know we have several counselors at the school. Do we have any mental health counselors at the school, or I know guidance counselors get a lot of mental health training at this point, but are there any mental health counselors at our school at this point?
So I can answer that. We do have school counselors, which are here tonight, but we also have Dr. Sarah Locke, who is a school psychologist and actually a registered clinical psychologist. And then actually several of our counselors also have their LPC, which they can speak to more clearly at that, but that professional licensure as well. And just knowing that there will be potentially additional need from our students for support during those days. When we are presenting at the high school, we'll be partnering with our elementary and middle school counselors if additional needs are there, so students aren't waiting, and then vice versa in the middle school as well. Having everybody kind of on call, so if the need is there, that we'll make sure we're meeting those needs in a timely fashion.
Well, thank you guys for taking the time tonight. It's Monday, right? I just had to think about what day it is. What kind of week we're having. Thank you for taking time on this Monday night. It was great to have you all here. If you haven't already, take the post survey, let us know what you thought. And certainly I'll be around up here if there's any other questions that you want to ask that you didn't want to ask in front of the larger group. But thank you for taking the time and have a wonderful evening.
The only thing I would echo is if you did not get a chance to sign in when you first came in, if you could sign in there. And again, if you have questions for me as well, I'll be here afterwards. But thank you for your time. Let's give her a round of applause.